Hi everyone, good morning, welcome. My name is Josh Kowalski, and we're really honored to have with us today Ben's grandmother, who will be talking to us a little bit about her experiences and thoughts about her time in Europe as a child and afterwards. And so I'll just simply get out of the way. And I guess Ben, would you like to introduce your grandmother?
Yeah, sure. So first, I want to thanks everyone for being here, and obviously, big thank you to my grandmother for doing this. I know it's very difficult to talk about this type of stuff, but so yeah, this is my grandma, Phyllis Milstein, and I guess we can just start off with grandma. Where were you born? Um, when were you born? And that type of stuff.
Okay. Okay. I was born in Piotrków, Poland, 1937. I was 2 years old when the war broke out, when the Germany attacked Poland. And we were all gathered in a ghetto, an enclosure, all the Jews. And we were there. And from there, the selection started. They used the people who were valuable to them, and they kept them in the ghetto, and the rest of them were sent to Treblinka, which is a concentration camp. I'm sure you know about that. I was 2 years old, so I really don't remember anything about the ghetto because what I know is what my mother told me. And basically, if it hadn't been for my mother, I wouldn't be here. She was a typical survivor. She needed a PhD in survival. What she went through, I wouldn't wish on anybody. But the only thing I can tell you is what I remember of the war myself. And that was when my parents saved me by the grace of God, because they certainly didn't need children. My mother was a seamstress, my father was a tailor, and he worked for them. He worked for the Nazis. He made uniforms for them. So they needed him. And my mother was a seamstress, and she was used by the wives of the Gestapo to sew their dresses and mend their dresses, and etc. So after a while, they closed the Piotrków. That was the Piotrków ghetto. It was called one of the first ghettos in Poland. They separated the men from the men and the women, and my mother and I and my cousin, who my mother saved, he lost his parents. His father went to Russia, and we never heard from him again. His mother went to Treblinka. So my mother kept him and myself, and we were separated from the men. The men went to I don't know if it was Theresienstadt or before Theresienstadt. They went to another country, Buchenwald. My father went to Buchenwald, and in Buchenwald, they did experiments on him. So my father was always sick. He had problems with his leg all his life. And then after that, he was in Theresen, which was just a horror. He almost lost his leg, but fortunately he didn't. And my mother and I, my grandmother and my aunt went to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was a very famous concentration camp. It was a women's concentration camp. Again, there we were like 8 people in a bed together with barracks. We hardly had any food to eat. Everybody was sick, died of typhus. And my mother worked in the field, collecting potatoes or something like that. I'm not sure. And she tried to, steal a potato, and she was beaten up because they found her stealing a potato. She wanted me to have some nutrition. And from that time on, she had lost her hearing in one ear. Then we were there for a few years. My grandmother died there. My aunt got sick with tuberculosis, and by the way, she survived. The only thing I remember from Ravensbrück is that walking outside, it was very normal for me as a child, because I didn't know anything better, to walk among the dead, to see corpses all over the place and not have reacted to it at all, because I didn't know any better than that. And that's something that I remember. I recall that, and I can't believe myself that I felt the way I did. Totally insensitive and oblivious to, I didn't know there was another world. From there, we were there about 7 months, I believe. I got sick. I got the mumps, and they put me in there was a hospital, and I was in a bed with other sick people and a woman who was a gypsy, and she stole all of my food because I got some food from somebody. There were some people there from other countries. They weren't necessarily Jewish, but they were imprisoned because of their beliefs. So there was some clergy and children. Everybody was together, and they helped me. They gave me some food that they received. They shared it with me, and then I don't know how many days I was in that hospital. I don't know how I survived. No idea. And so they were closing Ravensbrück, and I was in the hospital, and they were sending us. I don't know if you've ever seen those trains where they kept hundreds of people where they kept animals. I forgot.
Like a cattle car.
Cattle cars.
Yeah.
So they put.
Grandma, why were they closing? Why were they moving you?
Of course, I think the reason that they were closing is because that the Russians were coming. The Russians were invading Germany. This was Germany. Ravensbrück was in Germany. And they were getting closer. The Russians were getting closer. The Russians took over. The Russians liberated my aunt in Ravensbrück. My aunt was liberated in Ravensbrück, but everybody else was sent to Bergen-Belsen from there in cattle cars. And of course, on the way from Ravensbrück to Bergen-Belsen, and I remember that, people died in the cattle cars. They were already, you've seen some of the survivors and what they looked like, right? Skeletons. And the horror of that is something that I remember. Not very pleasant. Anyway, what happened was I was in the hospital, and my mother was being sent to Bergen-Belsen with my cousin. And my mother snuck me out of the hospital. How she did that, I think through the window, and some of the people helped her get me out through the window. She didn't want to leave me alone in the hospital, even though she knew we were going to die. But she didn't talk about it, but she knew we were going to die. And she wanted me with her. So she snuck me out, and we all went to Bergen-Belsen on these cattle cars. How long it took to get to Bergen-Belsen, I don't know. We got there. What I remember is then we got off the train. That I remember, because I was already almost 8 years old. So I was 2 for 6 years. I was dominated by the Nazis. I was ruled by the Nazis one way or another, mostly the other. And when we got off the train, we were all taken, and they were all talking about gas chambers. The people already knew about the gas chambers where they were killing people that way, and when we got off, we were all going into a bath. And okay, so they said, all right, that's it. It's not going to be water. It's going to be gas. We're going to be gassed. And we all got undressed. We're all nude, naked. And they shaved us. We were all shaved. It all looked the same. It's just horror. I remember that. And it was in the winter time. It was cold. I remember it was cold because we were liberated in April. So it was probably like February, March. And my mother kept me close to her so that she would give me some warmth. They disinfected us, and actually we did get a bath. It was not gas. And then we were taken to barracks, slept on the floor, one on top of the other. The people in front of me, there was a mother and a son and some children, and they all died. And I was happy that they died because I can stretch my legs. This is, you think about it. My mother sent me and my cousin out to beg for food. They thought maybe if children, they will not kill us. And so we went in the back of the kitchen, and they gave us some soup, some of the women there that worked in the kitchen. Because basically we were starved in Bergen-Belsen. We were not there very long, I think maybe 2 or 3 months, because if it had been any longer, we would not have survived. Almost everybody died. And we were liberated by the British. They were wonderful. They saved my life. Oh, I'm sorry, I just can't. The thought of it is just, anyway, I was very sick, and I ended up in the hospital with a very bad case of pneumonia. And basically the British doctors and the British nurses saved my life. And then my mother had to leave me. And so we were taken from the concentration camp, we were taken to Bergen-Belsen, where the soldiers lived, the barracks where the soldiers lived. So we had better condition, of course, living conditions. And we lived there for a very long time, actually, until I was 13, I believe. What happened was that we didn't know anything about my father. And some news came that my father was in Czechoslovakia, in Terezin. So my mother left to look for my father, and she left me and my cousin with an aunt and an uncle. And I got pneumonia. I got very sick during that time. When my mother found my father. How she found him is just a story that is not believed. She had no money. She would go on trains, just snuck into trains on top of coals, she was telling me, with criminals. And all these criminals that she was with helped her get to Terezin to find my father. She found some Jews along the way, and they told her, oh yeah, they heard about this man by the name of Oscar Frankel, who was my father. And finally, after I don't know how long, she found him in a hospital in Terezin. He was so small and so skinny that she could carry him. And she took him out of the hospital in Terezin. She found an ambulance. I don't know how. I have no idea. And the ambulance took him to Munich. And then he was taken to a hospital in Munich, and they put him on his feet. My mother came back to Bergen-Belsen because she had 2 children there. And my father recovered in Munich. And then I recovered in the hospital, and I almost died there. And my mother was told that if she went to Hamburg, she could find the medicine for me, which was, it was penicillin. They had discovered penicillin, 1945, they discovered penicillin. And my mother had to go and get it. And she had to get it on a Sabbath. Sabbath is a holy day for Jewish people. And the rabbi said, no, you cannot go to Hamburg. I think it was Hamburg. To get the medicine because it's Shabbat, it's Saturday. And but she said, I'm going anyway. So she just couldn't get it. Fortunately, she was not able to get penicillin because I'm allergic to penicillin, which I found out when I came here. But she never got the medicine. But when she got back to the hospital, I was getting better. And then, I got better. And my father, after a while, came to Bergen-Belsen to be with us. And I rejected my father because I wasn't used to having a father. And this man came with a long beard, and he could hardly walk, just looking horrible. And I rejected him. I didn't want him. And that I remember. But of course, after a while, he was my father. And so we were there. My father was sick for a very long time. We were not able to go anywhere. We had to stay there until we got on our feet. And then he got on his feet and he opened up. He was a tailor. My father was a tailor. So he opened, he was working. He actually hired 2 other people, and they were working in Bergen-Belsen sewing. And he was paid for it. So we had a president in Bergen-Belsen who was also a survivor. And so we were organized like a little town. But people were leaving. In 1948, a lot of them went to Israel. And then they had to go through a war there, and they went to fight on the side of the Israelis, and a lot of them died. So they went through a war in Europe, and then they went through a war in Israel. And I was 8 years old. Basically, I had no education, nothing. And they sent a group of people from Israel to teach us actually Hebrew and math or whatever it was. But what they did is they put 8-year-olds with 14-year-olds in the same classroom. So basically, we learned very little. And so slowly, the camp was being emptied because people were going to Israel. But we couldn't go to anywhere because my father was not well enough to go anywhere, even though he was working, and we lived kind of a normal life, more or less. Oh, and my cousin was with us the whole time. And my cousin he was an orphan. He had an aunt in Israel. He ended up going to Israel. They sent him to Israel to be with the aunt so that he would have some form of a normal life. And he lived with his aunt in Israel. We went from Bergen-Belsen. They closed that place because there weren't enough people left. Most of them had gone to Israel, and some of them went to America. But so they took whoever was left there. And I was maybe 13 by that time. We went to a place called Upjever. That also been some kind of a camp, but it was very nice. And we had an apartment. We lived in an apartment. And my father was working. I don't know, he was managing to work and to make some money. So I know my father made some money because, and also in Upjever, I went to a German school. My mother said, you cannot just hang around and do nothing. You have to go to school. So my mother went to a school in Upjever and asked them if they would take me. By the way, I spoke German. By that time, I spoke German very well. I still do. And I went to school in Upjever in a probably a high school or a junior high, something like that. But I didn't know anything. I didn't know math. I didn't know science. I didn't know anything. I could hardly read or write. And I didn't do well, of course. But also, I was rejected. They would not befriend me. The children, there was one girl there who was a Catholic. All the other ones were Protestant. I think that the German people, what kind of Protestant did they follow? I forgot. Anyway, they were Protestant, and she was Catholic. She was rejected as well by the classmates, and she was my friend. And I had no one to talk to. I was miserable. It was just horrible. But my mother made me go to school because she said, you have to get some education. You can't just, what are you going to do with yourself? And I took piano lessons in Upjever. I went once a week by bus from this camp, Upjever, to a teacher in the town, and I learned how to play the piano. So at any rate, from there, we came to the United States. They got enough money together. I don't know how we did it, but we came with the SS Europe. I remember the boat. Of course, I was 14 years old at that time. And my father sewed me beautiful clothes, which was worthless in America because it wasn't in style. And I found out it was really strange. In Upjever, there were people who were coming from America. I don't know why or for what reason, but they told me that the girls in America use lipstick at the age of 14. And I said, what? You know, it's very strange that girls that age wear lipstick and high heels. And, you know, I mean, I was interested in girly stuff already. Oh, by the way, also there, we went to the movies. And I remember that I liked Tyrone Power and Jane Powell. These were actors and actresses who were American. We were shown American films. So I spent a lot of my young years in Germany. And at any rate, we came here. Wasn't easy. My father was always sick with his leg. We were lucky that we were not taken off the boat and deported because my father was sick. And they didn't take, they had inspectors who came on the boat to see if we were healthy to come to America because they didn't let, you know, sick people come here. I don't know, my mother was so clever. She got my father through. And we ended up in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And if you want to ask me any more questions, that was my, I went through, it was very, very difficult to adjust. I wanted to go back to Germany because that's the only thing I knew. I didn't like it here. I didn't belong here. And I was in junior high. Mm-hmm. And they put me in a class with slow learners. They gave me a test in English. Of course, I failed it. It was an IQ test. Mm-hmm. And the IQ test showed that I was retarded. But that's the wrong word, sorry. Mentally unfit, I don't know, whatever the word is. What is it? What am I supposed to say? You can't say retarded. At any rate, so I was in this class and my teacher's name was Miss O'Brien, and she said, this girl does not belong in this class. So they switched me. I went to a normal class, and the teacher's name was Mrs. Neff. And I adjusted, I learned fast, and I did better than everybody else in that class.
And Grandma, like when you came here, you said that, I remember you telling me that you were discriminated against, yes, not only by other people, but by Jewish people. Yes. And that, you know, like you would become friends with people and their parents would say, you can't be friends with her, you know, she was, and so.
They didn't want me to tell them what I went through.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want them to feel bad.
Yeah.
So they didn't, but the non-Jews were the ones that were interested in me. And most of my friends were not Jewish. Right. But after a while, I learned English, and you know, I was like almost I wanted to be like everybody else.
Yeah.
You know, my friend was very good friend, Judy Blume. You hear of Judy Blume, the author? Yeah. She was my friend. She comes from Elizabeth. Wow. Yeah. She was in junior high with me. She was in the same class, and she befriended me. Then there was another girl who was in junior high with me, Almita. She's a very well-known violinist. She became my friend, and her family helped me a lot. She had her brother-in-law was a professor. He took me under his wing, and he taught me math and science on the side, just as a friend. I babysat with his children, and they just, you know, I was like one of the family, and I still am with that family. They're very well-known musicians.
And Grandma, when you came here after came here from Germany, most people they didn't even want to talk about the war. They just kind of like said that's in the past, and they
No,
didn't want to hear about it, right?
no, they didn't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
No.
And so how long, like later after?
I realized that I better not talk about it, and not that I volunteered. I didn't volunteer to talk about it, but I wasn't ashamed of it. But after a while, I realized that if I want to be like everybody else and assimilate,
Mhm.
I better just forget about it. And
Yeah.
so I didn't. I didn't think about it. It's just something that was my past, and that was that. But I heard about it every single day in my house. My aunt, who lived in Philadelphia, whenever she visited, she and my mother would sit for hours and talk about every single day. They remembered every single day of the war, every minute of the war, all the names. It was amazing, amazing. And it was. I remember I remember in when we were in the ghetto. I remember the Nazis walking around these huge dogs, and they were sniffing to see if anybody was hidden. Because some people were hidden, some Jewish people who didn't belong there. They weren't supposed to be there. They had what they called appels, where they selected people to go to Treblinka, and those that stayed and those went. Every day was a appel. Everybody would have to leave the barracks and stand and wait to see who would stay and who would leave.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they didn't want any children. I was a young child, and so on one of them, my mother was sure that was going to be it. That I was going to be taken from them, and I was going to be sent with all the
Yeah.
other children.
And Grandma, you were hidden, right? You were hidden in the ghetto.
It was in the ghetto, at the end of the ghetto.
Right.
Yes, they hid me in a cellar. My uncle put a lot of garbage on top of us, and the Nazis would walk around with sticks and try to see was anybody there, to see if they would hear any people. And fortunately, they didn't hear us, but others were taken out of their hiding places. And my mother and my father were outside because they knew they were going to survive, because they needed them for work. My mother was pretty good shape. My mother was very heavy, which was very good because she lost all that weight, but she looked normal. When she lost 40 pounds, she looked like a normal person. So they needed her. She was a very hard worker. And my father was the tailor.
Mm-hmm.
So they kept him, but they didn't need me.
Yeah.
So my mother, when they were waiting there to be selected, my mother saw the Nazis coming out with children, barefoot, they found them somewhere. And my mother said this was going to be the end of her life, because her child is going to Treblinka. Mm-hmm. But they didn't find us. And we survived.
But why did you, I mean, you ultimately obviously went to Ravensbrück. Why did you eventually have to leave the ghetto and go to Ravensbrück?
They closed the ghetto.
Okay.
Closed. Mm-hmm.
So I think we can.
The termination of the Hitler. This is, even right now, I wonder how somebody like that was followed by so many millions of people. They believed in somebody like that, who believed in the extermination of an entire people, because that was his aim. His aim at the beginning was just to get rid of the Jews in Germany. But for some reason, it was too slow for him. I don't know, whatever. Then he determined that let all the Jews in the world die. Mm-hmm. I mean, for what reason? What was his reason? Except that when he was young, he had some bad experiences with Jewish people. I don't really know. But to this day, I cannot understand how so many people, and something like this is happening again. So what is human nature? What are people like that they can follow somebody like that? And they did, millions and millions of people. And there are Nazi parties in Germany now too.
That's why it's so important that it's continued to be taught, and that we have, people talking and telling us about this, because anti-Semitism is on the rise. It always is on the rise. And mm-hmm. if we're not educated on the past, it can happen again. And that's why it's so important that this continues to be taught.
But the thing is, there are people who say, what other nationalities also went through hell. Also, right now, there are people who are suffering. Look at Ukraine. What's happening, by the way? The Ukrainians, I mean, I don't want to say anything, but during the war, it wasn't just Germany. I mean, the Ukrainians helped the Germans. They told them where the Jews were, the Poles. They helped the Germans. They told them where the Jews were. At one point, and there were a lot of Poles who saved Jews and a lot of Germans who saved Jews. And my parents had friends who were Polish, Jewish Polish. And one of their very good friends said, we were already in the Piotrkovo ghetto. She said to my mother, why don't you come and stay with me? I'll try to save you and your daughter. By the way, I had blue eyes and blonde hair, so I could get away with being German very easily, but being Polish very easily, Christian very easily. So we went there, we went to her house, and she said, I'm going to try to save you. But she knew what was happening to the Jews. And then we were there for a short period of time. My father was in the ghetto. My father worked. My father was still, he knew the Nazis. He spoke to them all the time because he was working for them, was making beautiful. My father was an extremely fine tailor, and they loved his work. And some of them really liked the uniforms that he made for them. So he stayed. And my mother and I went, and we were hidden by this family behind a wall. And then one day she came home and she said, you have to leave because there was a warning that if anybody was saving Jews, the whole family, everybody would be killed.
When was this, Grandma? Was this in the ghetto? Or
when we were in the ghetto, when I was 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, something like that.
Right.
She said to my mother, I will keep your daughter because she looks Christian, but you've got to go because you look Jewish. You've got to go. And my mother said, I'm not leaving my child. So my mother and I, at night, she helped my mother go back to the ghetto. And as my mother and I were walking, my mother kept saying shh to me because I was a child. I wanted to talk. I wanted to laugh. I don't know. I didn't understand what was going on really. And she held me very tight and she told me to be very quiet because there were soldiers outside. And if they saw us, they would, kill us. They would just shoot us. And finally, both of us got into the ghetto. And she said, when we got back into the ghetto, everybody was screaming, why are you back? Why did you come back? Why did you come back? And she said, I had to come back because the woman couldn't keep us. I mean, you can't blame her,
Yeah.
But at the same time, you want to save yourself. So from there, my father found us in the ghetto and my mother was sure that we were going to Treblinka from there. So, but, it was just, to think that we survived is very difficult, but there's so many books and there's so many books about how people survived.
Yeah.
So I'm just one of many.
Yeah. Speaking of books, I'm not sure, you may already know this book, but there was recently, actually just last year, published a book entitled The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. And it's about, I think actually, women tailors who created clothes mostly for the wives of the SS officers.
Well, my mother, that was my mother. We were not in Auschwitz, but my aunt and uncle, by the way, the ones that my mother left us with, they were Auschwitz. They were survivors of Auschwitz. They had the number. I did not have it. And I was so happy that I didn't have a number because that's how people knew that I was in a concentration camp. So I didn't want them to know.
Yeah. A number of students have already been sending in questions via chat. And one student asked, for example, when you came to America, did you come through Ellis Island? And then the part two of that a question by that same student is also, did you ever return to Germany afterwards?
Okay, we didn't. This is something that I skipped. We came by the SS Europe was a luxury liner. I don't know, my father made some money in camps, by working. And I think that he made something like $5,000 altogether in all the years. So we were able to get on this SS Europe, and we had cabins. We was fun, you know, we had beautiful clothes because my father made it, and we came to the United States, and we were not like that DPs, displaced people. We were displaced people because we had DP cards. We didn't have passports because we didn't belong anywhere. We belonged in Poland, but we weren't going to go back to Poland. And we didn't have passports. So that's how we came. As you know, they're just little things that I remember very well. I remember the dress that my mother made me, and that I wore on the boat. On the boat, we ate together with passengers. We met two American women who had been teachers, and they went to Europe on a trip. This was already 1951. I came here in 1951. So when we landed in New York, and the inspectors came on the boat to check us to make sure that we were okay, that we were healthy, my mother hid my father because my father was not healthy, and they would have taken us to Ellis Island had they found my father the way he had developed some kind of a rash. He didn't look well. He had a one leg that he suffered with always. And I don't know how my mother hid him or what she did, how she did it. I don't know. But we got through, and then we did not go to Ellis Island. What was the other question?
Have you ever returned to Europe since?
Oh, yes, that was another question. Not until this year. We went on a riverboat trip. I wasn't going to Germany ever again. And we love riverboat trips, my husband and I. And this was the only one that we hadn't gone on in Europe. And this one included a lot of Germany, going to Germany. So we went, my husband and I went on this trip. This was in August this year.
Was it on the Rhine River?
Yeah. It was a gorgeous trip. By the way, in Germany, of course, it's a beautiful country. I can't take that away from them. I mean, and I realized that the younger people, the Germans, kind of feel guilty. And they showed us a lot of places in Germany where they're trying to make it better, to how do you call it, to exonerate themselves. They took us to homes and to businesses that used to belong to Jewish people, and they had their names and they had the Jewish star in front of them. In Bonn, was it? Bonn. Some of the towns that we went to, and we also had one of the guys was German, and he told everybody the story of what was going on in Germany, very open. And it's kind of a guilt I felt that the German people felt for what happened. Of course, the younger generation is not like the older generation, but I had a hard time being in Germany. And then we were invited to somebody's home in Germany. What was the name of the town? A woman who was my age, about my age. So she was telling them what they went through, what she went through during the war. And of course, I did not tell her about myself at all, because I didn't want to start. We were with other people, and I didn't want to go through this whole thing. I spoke German with her. So she asked me, how come you spoke German? And I said, well, we spoke German at home. I lied. So we did not speak German at home. We spoke Yiddish at home.
Another student asks about your sort of religious experience. Like, did going through, what you experienced make you more or less religious?
At the time, more. Yes, my parents were traditional, and they were not Orthodox, but they were traditional Jews. The Sabbath. Yes, I came to the United States. At the beginning, I went to a yeshiva to study, but then I didn't want to. I didn't want to go to Hebrew school. I didn't want to go to a private school. I wanted to go to a public school. So I went to regular school.
Mhm.
But the yeshiva was only for a short period of time. And my parents were always very traditional. Myself, you know, I'm just Jewish.
Mhm.
Nothing, you know, I keep the holidays. We used to belong to a synagogue, all that, but we're not Orthodox. We're not religious.
Okay. Quite a few students were asking about your experience in Bergen-Belsen and being liberated.
Mhm.
And like, did you understand that this was like the end of the war, or was it kind of a confusing experience when suddenly?
For me, it was, what I remember is that the screaming in the barracks, the screaming of people that somebody was coming, the planes were coming, somebody was liberating us.
Mhm.
I didn't quite understand. You know, one other thing that they were going to poison us. The Germans were going to poison us
Mhm.
before we were invaded by the British. One of the doctors who was in charge there said, no, do not do that. And they didn't. They did not poison us. This is something my mother told me. I didn't know anything about it. This doctor at the war, after the war, he
Mhm.
was very smart to do what he did because he was venerated. He was,
Mhm.
you know, the star of the show basically because he saved so many people's lives. So he was not incarcerated. He was not trialed. A lot of them were tried. A lot of the
Right.
Nazis were tried. Um, my father was a witness, one of the trials.
Wow.
My mother was in Israel during the Eichmann trial. My
Mhm.
mother was there in the
Wow.
audience. Yeah. Mhm. Anything else? Look, I
No,
left
just
out a lot because it's impossible to. I could
yeah.
write.
Yeah, no, there are quite a few other questions as well. I'll try to sort of get a couple of them
Sure.
to you. And one was, so you were liberated by the British troops in Bergen-Belsen, and then you stayed on in a nearby DP camp. Is that right?
Yeah.
And what was it like being in another camp, even though
But it was
technically
not
you're
a concentration camp. It
right,
was
right,
the camp where the soldiers lived.
right. So with barracks and so forth.
Yeah, they were barracks and they separated, like they would have curtains in the
Hmm.
barracks and then families would be, whatever
Hmm.
families were left were together.
Right.
And my aunt
It was
and
a DP camp, right, Mom? It was
yeah,
a
that was a
displaced.
DP displaced
Right.
people. Because none of us had a home, we had no place. So it was like we had a little government. We had a president,
Hmm.
and we had a police.
Hmm.
Um, I had friends. We played together, you know, hopscotch. You know, and
Mom, the time between the time you liberated from the concentration camp to the time you left on the boat, what was that time frame?
that was from the age of 8 to the age of 14.
So you lived in Germany in Bergen-Belsen DP camp for that long.
That's right. We went to Upiever, remember? We lived in Upiever, but there was a short period of time, maybe a year. Yeah, then they closed that camp to that place also. But then there was nobody left. And what happened when we were, I think in Bergen-Belsen, and when we were in Bergen-Belsen, but the DP camp, people were coming back from Israel because there was a war, there was no food, a lot of sick, and they came back and they told my father, if you go to Israel, you will die there, because he was always sick. We had already sent everything to Israel. We were going to Israel from Bergen-Belsen. We were going to go to Israel by boat. So whatever we had belonged, I had a piano, a Steinway piano I had. And my mother and my father had a Singer sewing machine because he was going to work in Israel. They sent everything to Israel before we left, because it took a long time for everything to get there. And these people were coming back from Israel saying, my father will never survive. Do not go there. So we did not go. And we left everything in Israel. We had no idea what happened to all our belongings. My piano, my father's machine, sewing machine. That we never found out what happened to it. So we never went. But we were going to go to Israel. Don't forget that after the war, they sent a group of Israelis to teach us. It was mostly so that we learned Hebrew songs, we were Zionists. The children were Zionists because that's what we were taught. So that because we didn't go to Israel, I was very unhappy. I wanted to go to Israel. All my friends were going to Israel and we were staying. So I didn't have many friends left. The friends that I had were all older. They were 17 years old, 18 years. Those were my friends. This one, my mother decided that I have to go to school because I didn't know how to read and write. I didn't know how to do anything. What was amazing is that I learned all this here, and it was quite simple. It was very easy for me to keep up. I don't know. Maybe I was smart. I don't know.
Did you ever get a chance to visit Israel then afterwards?
Yeah, I married an Israeli.
Okay.
Yes. But when I graduated from college, I went to college. I went to Elmira College. And then to Temple University in Philadelphia. When I finished college, I wanted to go to law school, and my parents, I wanted to go to law school, but I said I'm going to take a year off, and I wanted to go to Israel. I did. I was always Zionist, very Zionist. And when I went to Israel, I wanted to stay there. Once I went there, I wanted to remain in Israel, and I met my husband there.
Great.
So then we came back here.
And I think that my grandma was being a little humble because really she came from being in a DP camp in Germany and not being able to read or write. And then she came to the States where they thought that she had a mental disability and thought that she was slow. And then from that in high school, she was the salutatorian of her high school. And then went to Elmira College and transferred to Temple College. And, really kind of made a success out of, out of impossible odds. So it's really just incredible.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. That's a very, very impressive story. Yeah. So have you ever met other survivors, since, obviously when you're in the DP camp, right? But since coming to America? And if so, did you ever feel the need to talk to them about your experiences and their experiences? In other words, did you have any bonding with other survivors or no?
Not at all. However, my best friend from the war, who was with me all along, we played together in the sandbox in Poland. She also survived Bergen-Belsen. She and her mother survived and she went to Israel.
Okay. So
when I went to Israel after college, we became friends again. So, and I'm still in touch with her. So when we get together, we never talk about the war. I see her all the time because I've been to Israel about 20 times.
Right.
Because we went every year, we went to Israel. So, and I would see her and we would get together, their families. She got married. She has 3 kids and grandchildren and doing very well in Israel. And we would never talk. We would talk about our parents, but we would not talk about the war. No.
And when did you start talking about the war? Did you talk about it, for example, to your son and grandson and other grandchildren, or?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, I can interject there, Professor. So I'm Ben's dad. I'm Joey Milstein, Phyllis's son. My sister and I, my sister's 3 years my senior. We weren't stupid. We could do math, and I think we knew that in Poland in 1937. But we just didn't question it. And truth be told, until the age of 14, and my sister was 17, we really didn't know. It was actually kept from us. And my mother, I remember my sister and I were about to get our driver's license, and I don't know what the circumstances were, but my mother sat us down and shared what she's telling us right now for the first time, and it made tons of sense. All of a sudden, all the dots were connected. And I know it may be selfish, but ever since then, I took it upon myself to share my mother's story, in spite or despite her encouragement or admonishment not to, because I felt it was just that important. So it's something that, it's in my DNA, and it's kind of, even though of course I didn't share the experience, it's the prism from which I look at life, what my mother, my grandmother, and what my extended family.
Yeah. There are so-called 2G or second generation groups that meet and even sometimes, write stories about their parents and the ways in which their parents' experiences, even though they may have not have known directly what had happened, their parents' experiences still shaped who they were as they were growing up in America.
Yeah.
Mhm. Wow.
Yeah, I know. My parents belonged to an organization of Piotrków, people from Piotrków,
Mhm.
but I never did.
And I would say really
Um,
for myself, I was the only like I would say pretty much last year was probably one of the first times that I really kind of went in depth and asked
Mhm.
my grandmother questions about what happened
Right.
and I did a presentation on her and I mean I like so I guess kind of what my dad said is like it definitely learning about it has changed my perspective on life because it's like the problems that I have in my modern day life and the things that I face is nothing it's not even close to compared to what my grandmother faced so it's just like I think it gives like a new appreciation for everything that we have freedom and opportunity that was not there.
One thing I can tell you about surviving, um, it's kind of necessary for somebody like myself to not dwell or think about it or talk about it or think it. And sometimes I don't even believe that I went through this, to tell you the truth,
Mhm.
because I kept it away from me for a long time and it just wasn't me. It was somebody else. So, but it affected me.
Mhm.
It did affect me. In many ways, it affected me very much, psychologically. And don't forget, also, I heard about it all my life, right when I lived at home, because my mother always spoke about the war and everything that she went through.
Mhm.
So my mother lost her whole family. She had 7 brothers and sisters, and they were all exterminated. And nephews and nieces and cousins. And my mother was the sole survivor. My father, on the other hand, his sister and brother both survived. So my mother was jealous of my father because he had family, she had nobody.
Mhm.
It affected her psychologically, and then in turn, it affected me as well. But it's just, you have to move on. You cannot think about things like that. I wanted to live life. So.
Mom, your mother was she was the sole survivor of her entire family. But your father, my grandfather, he was one of 3 that survived. Of how many?
There were 5 of them, 5 children. Mhm. His mother is my grandmother. I have a picture of her, actually. She was in the camps with us. She was in Ravensbrück with us. She died in Ravensbrück, right in front of us. People died all around me. And it was just normal. For me, this was normal.
Yeah.
You have people die all around me. I could stretch my legs because the woman that was on top of me died. Think about it. So you have to dismiss this from your mind. You can't think about it at all. By the way, I live in a community where nobody knows anything about my past. What they know is that I wasn't born here. That's it.
Mhm. Wow. So you still, to this day, you still don't share this with just acquaintances, only very close family and friends and so forth. But I have a question. Do you ever feel the need to, say, watch films about the Holocaust, like Schindler's List, or
Do
read
I
books
watch it?
about it
I
by
watch
such as Anne Frank?
I read and watch everything about the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, my husband and I were watching a movie last night
Mhm.
on Prime TV. On Prime TV, they have a lot of movies about the war. We watch all of them.
Wow.
My neighbors here, they don't want to see one of them. It's too unpleasant. Enough already with the concentration camps, with the Nazis. I belong to a book club. So we did 1 or 2 books, and whenever anybody says, "Oh, let's read so and so another book about the war," they don't want to read about it enough, So that you can understand why I don't want to talk about it to anybody, because I have one friend who lives in another community. We've been friends for many years, and finally I decided that I was going to tell her about my life, and I told her, and we're still best friends. She doesn't want to know anything about my experiences. It's too unpleasant.
Right.
So I think the younger generation, she's my age, but the younger generations are different.
Yeah.
They are much more curious, and maybe because they are younger and they think differently.
Mhm.
And then, I mean, I felt a lot of prejudice because I was a DP. I was a displaced person. I had no home. By the way, we went to Poland. My husband and I went to Poland with my daughter. After, when was that? About 10 years ago? Something like that.
6, 7 years.
And
We went
I
to
got my
Auschwitz.
birth certificate in Piotrków. There are no Jews left in Piotrków. The last Jew died a few years ago. And there was a man who was not Jewish who took it upon himself. He felt Polish guy. He felt guilty about what happened in Poland. And he learned everything that happened to the Jewish people in Piotrków. So when we went to Poland, we contacted him. And he knew everything and everybody. He knew the house where I was born, the Jewish street. It was called Judengasse. Gasse. Do you speak German, by the way? Yeah.
Yes, I do.
And he was just wonderful. He was just wonderful. So we learned a lot because he did. He took us to the cemetery where my husband's grandfather was buried. He showed us the city because I didn't remember anything about the town. And he said, and we saw Hakenkreuzen all over the place in Piotrków. He said, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland, he told us.
Speaking of languages, another student asked about Yiddish. So we heard you say that you spoke Yiddish in Poland.
Yeah.
After coming to America, did you continue to speak it at home?
Yeah. I didn't speak Polish I didn't speak Yiddish in Poland. I spoke Polish in Poland.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, because I was born in Poland. I was.
Right.
We started speaking Yiddish when we came here.
Okay.
And I spoke Yiddish at home, and I speak Yiddish very well.
Okay.
I read and write it also.
Okay. Do you want to say something to us in Yiddish?
Ja, ich kann reden Yiddish sehr gut. Es ist du was Yiddish? Does anybody speak Yiddish there? Ich spreche Deutsch, aber ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch.
Yeah, I can understand about half of Yiddish things.
But it's very similar, right? Yeah. I speak Polish also. I still remember it. The funny thing is that when my mother was sick, and my mother was 95 when she passed away. When she was 92, it was time to get somebody to stay with her. And it was a Polish woman. So she only spoke Polish. She didn't speak any other language. So it came back to me, and I spoke Polish with her. So I know some Polish also, but I had no education in Polish.
Yeah.
I didn't go to school in Poland. I went to school only in Germany. And I learned very little because I had no introduction. So, yeah.
Does anybody else in our course have any questions? So, I mean, it's an incredibly sort of tragic story on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's also a story of overcoming adversity. And as such, it's really inspiring to us. And so, we're very, very grateful to you for being willing to share some of your experiences.
My pleasure.
These are the sorts of things as far as I know, the students will have a really indelible memory of them years and years after they've forgotten everything else that they learned in the semester, but they'll remember this.
I hope so. And it was my pleasure.
Yeah.
If it hadn't been for my grandson, I would have never done that. But
yeah. So, and thank you so much to Ben and to the
thank you again to my grandma, because I know
I just want to say my reward is my grandchildren.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again, and I hope that everyone kind of took something from this, and because really this is the first time that I think you've ever really shared your story with this many people, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. So
this has really been a highlight of our semester. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story.
Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.